recognize every effort should be made to keep kratom risks low and protect consumers from adulterated and contaminated kratom products. To that end, AKA supports the following efforts. 1, regulation. AKA supports the appropriate FDA regulations to ensure the safety and purity of kratom products. And let us be clear on that. The leaf is sacrosanct. We're talking about adulterated, we're talking about tincture, we're talking about extraction methodologies, we're talking about controlling the purity of the product. 2, children. While federal surveys have not identified the use of kratom products in children as an emerging problem, AKA nonetheless supports efforts to prevent youth use. Purity. AKA supports standards for product purity just as there are for most food products. Potential adulterants. AKA would welcome FDA standards to prevent contamination or adulteration of kratom products with dangerous substances. AKA also supports appropriate monitoring to reassure consumers that their lawfully purchased products meet purity and manufacturing standards. Claims consistent with the Dietary Supplement Health and Education Act of '94, DSHEA, AKA will work with the FDA to ensure that AKA's statements do not constitute inappropriate claims. AKA encourages FDA to work with manufacturers and marketeers to develop labeling that is appropriate and helpful to consumers. I hope you agree that is a powerful statement coming from an industry that wants to treat its consumers right and to be held to appropriate standards. Our message today is very simple. Kratom is safe botanical that does not kill people. If the government bans kratom, more people will die. Kratom is an alternative to opioids, not a gateway to opioid abuse. And the American Kratom Association supports appropriate FDA regulations to ensure product quality and safety for consumers. That concludes my formal statement. Turn things back over to Pat Mitchell. Pat?
Again, those are the opening comments of AKA Chair Dave Herman. Our second speaker this morning is Dr. Jack Henningfield. And here's a little background on Dr. Henningfield. Dr. Jack Henningfield is Vice President of Research, Health Policy, and Abuse Liability at PinneyAssociates. Dr. Henningfield previously served as Chief of the Clinical Pharmacology Research Branch of the National Institutes of Health's National Institute on Drug Abuse, and is currently an adjunct professor of behavioral biology in the Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences at the Johns Hopkins University School of Medicine. Dr. Henningfield and his PinneyAssociates colleagues conducted a comprehensive review of publicly available data about kratom on the same 8 factors that the DEA and FDA weigh in deciding to control a substance. Dr. Henningfield?
Thank you. Good morning. It's a pleasure to be here. Most of my work at PinneyAssociates and over my career has been service of public health policy through science and working on products like kratom that serve people and finding a regulatory pathway. Based on the science, the potential public health impact, and in the context of our nation's opioid crisis, I conclude that keeping kratom available to people is in our nation's vital public health interest. However, I also support balanced regulation, and some of that are the principles that you just heard from Mr. Herman. These are the kinds of reasonable things that FDA can do and should do to help keep the public protected. But let me tell you a little bit more about the science that led to our conclusions. I'll start with the what, how, who, and why. I will also make a few comments on kratom safety and kratom in the context of our nation's opioid crisis. What? What is kratom? Well, kratom is a tree native to Southeast Asia, and its leaves have been used for at least hundreds of years as a natural herbal medicine in Southeast Asia, and it still is to this day. In the United States, the term kratom refers to both the natural leaf material that is powdered or chopped, as well as manufactured extracts. Kratom naturally contains substances called mitragynines that, like caffeine in the coffee bean, provide a lot of the effects that people come to rely on for kratom. Not surprisingly, since kratom is actually in the coffee family, some of its effects resemble caffeine. For example, some people use it as a pick-me-up in the morning like they do coffee. That's a real contrast to opioids, by the way. But it also can provide some mild opioid effects, like relieving diarrhea, cough, and pain. However, kratom does not cause the powerful respiratory depressing effects that are a major effect of narcotic like opioids. I'm not sure that FDA Commissioner Gottlieb was aware of that when he released his advisory. But I'll come back to that later. The how. How is kratom used? Well, we know how opioids are used. Some are swallowed, but they're also injected, snorted, and smoked. Kratom is virtually exclusively used orally in the form of teas, beverages, warm and cold, sometimes powder that is added to food and swallowed. It doesn't taste very good, so it's added to things to help get it down. There are also a variety of liquid kratom extracts that you can get. This is another contrast to opioids and other drugs of abuse that are often, as I mentioned, injected, snorted, and smoked to intensify their euphoria. Those drugs do have a powerful euphoria, and every effort is made to intensify it. That's not the case with kratom. Who uses kratom? Well, we now have 4 national surveys. The 4th was done by my group, and it will be presented at a major scientific meeting next week, but I'll mention a few results. The 4 national surveys all tell us some of the same things, even though they were all independent. They tell us about who uses kratom. Well, first, it's like people in this room. It's a cross-section of America. It tends to be people that are working, have health care, have some level of college education. More than half of the people in the surveys are either married or in marital-like relationships. In other words, this is America that is using kratom. In terms of age, it's depending on how you define middle age, that keeps moving up for me, but it's basically middle-age America as the main body of kratom users. All 4 surveys found that most people were in their 30s and 40s. Why do people use kratom? Well, I'll start out with why they don't use it. They don't use it because it tastes great, because it doesn't. They don't use it to get high, because it's a lousy way to get high. And people that have tried report that. And in fact, people that look for better ways to get high and then report it on the internet tell you just that. If you want to get an opioid-like high, use a real opioid. So why do people use it? Well, the 4 independent surveys tell us that people use it for health reasons. They use it for pain that is generally mild. Some people use it for more severe types of pain, a variety of types of pain. We know that pain varies from person to person, and different people find different approaches useful. Some people find kratom very useful for their pain. Some people use it for stress, anxiety, and depressed mood states. And for them, they say it works very well. In our survey, they said 90% said it worked well to very well. Some people use it as a pick-me-up in the morning the way other people use coffee. Also, in contrast to opioids, many people say they use it to improve their occupational performance by increasing and improving their attention and alertness and focus. That's not why people use opioids. And finally, there's an important fraction of kratom users that use it to stay off of opioids. Whether they were using opioids for pain or because they had become addicted to opioids, they find kratom is a way to stay off of opioids. Some of the people have been off of opioids drinking kratom tea for several years. Kratom safety. The overall documented safety potential of kratom puts it well within the range of over-the-counter drugs and other dietary supplements and dietary ingredients. Now, nothing is 100% safe, and so you have standards that allow you to market something over the counter or as a dietary ingredient, and kratom is well within that range. In fact, in a major comparative study of emergency room mentions by the FDA and CDC, published in the New England Journal of Medicine in November 2015, they looked at 30,000 some cases. Kratom did not show up once. That doesn't mean there weren't any cases. It means the safety signal is very small compared to commonly used medicines and herbal therapies and other products. With respect to deaths, we have yet to document a single death that could be reasonably be concluded to be considered a kratom overdose death or a poisoning death. Now, we have about 90 of these a day from opioids. How does that occur? Well, respiratory depression. It's almost like an off switch. You push a real opioid up high enough and breathing stops. Same thing with alcohol and sedatives. With cocaine or amphetamine, you push the dose high enough up and you can get cardiac arrest. These drugs produce poisonings that are reliable, and we can document it in animals and people. We have yet to document that for kratom. Has it been present and sometimes used by people? Well, you hear more about that later from Mr. Haddow, but the answer is yes. The question was, did it have any involvement? And if it did, what was its involvement? A kratom in the opioid crisis. Let me finish up here. One of the important things that we found over the last couple of years is that there are many people that are using kratom in place of opioids, to which they had become addicted, or they found kratom as an acceptable alternative to opioids for pain management, and they wanted to get off of opioids. They wanted to do what many federal agencies are saying, which is, if you've got pain, try something other than an opioid first, and if that works, don't go to opioid. Or if you're on an opioid, try something else and see if that works. People are listening, they're doing it with kratom, and for many people it works. I can tell you the surveys show they are terrified of losing access to kratom. They are terrified, and many say they will turn to black market sources of kratom. The black market for kratom will explode and metastasize if legal kratom is banned, and that is a deadly scary market. We hear about problems in the illicit market. They are nothing compared to what we will see with the black market. They are also terrified because there are people that are using it in place of opioids. And they know what people like me who study opioid addiction know, that if you take away the lifeline that is keeping somebody off of opioids, a lot of those people will go back to opioids, and some of those people will die. That's a reality. Unfortunately, as suggested by the FDA advisory on November 14th, that equated kratom with narcotic-like opioids under a headline touting deadly risks associated with kratom, the FDA commissioner did not seem to understand what millions of kratom users know and what the science tells us. It is a path away from opioids, not a path to opioids. And whether it's concentrated in extracts or consumed in very large amounts in tea or given to animals, it does not produce respiratory depression, and it does not produce the powerful euphoriant effects that opioids do. And as I mentioned, 4 U.S. national surveys have all concluded this, and I will be showing some of these data in more detail at a scientific meeting next week. I would not want to be part of a federal agency following the banning of kratom, because following the banning of kratom, the headlines are predictable. Working mother of 3 children had been off opioids for 2 years. The government banned kratom, she went back to opioids, and now she is dead. Why did the government ban kratom when this was foreseeable? That's what motivates me in this area. We do not have a public health crisis with kratom. If we ban it, we will create a public health problem that is deadly serious. Finally, we need a path to keep kratom available to realize its potential to help keeping Americans manage their own health and health care. We do not want to replace that with the black market that will surely spring up. Kratom is an asset that is here today. It is not a pie-in-the-sky theoretical solution to the opioid crisis. There is no simple solution, but kratom is one asset that we do not want to lose. I hope we can all work together to help FDA to find a path to keep kratom available to people and improve its safety record. Thank you.
Again, that was the opening statement of addiction expert Dr. Jack Henningfield. You can find the December 2016 8-factor analysis he referred to on the website for the American Kratom Association. Our third and final speaker today is Mac Haddow. Mr. Haddow is the Legislative Director of the American Kratom Association. Mac?
Thank you, Patrick. I know that there are a lot of people out on Facebook Live that missed the first part of this presentation. It's my understanding that the full presentation will be available on the AKA website shortly after the conclusion of this event, so you can go back and watch it. It's one of the marvels of modern technology that, as smart as some people are, technological glitches get in the way of some of the best planned events. I should tell you that we believe that there are some very smart people at the FDA. But because you're smart doesn't mean that you're always right. For example, Paul Krugman, who is a Nobel laureate in economics, took on a project in 1998 where he looked at the impact that the internet would have on the American economy. He concluded, after crunching all of the numbers using the most sophisticated data analytics available, that in 2005 it was expected that the internet's impact on the American economy would be no greater than the fax machine. He was wrong. Very smart guy, one of the smartest in the world in economics, but he relied upon bad data in order to draw a conclusion that was unsupportable by the facts and reality today. Fast forward to 2016, just a little over a year ago, and the FDA went to the Drug Enforcement Administration and requested that kratom be banned as a substance and put into a Schedule 1 of the Controlled Substances Act. They did that under the emergency scheduling powers of the Controlled Substances Act passed by Congress. Their argument was that, in fact, it was deadly. Kratom is deadly. Now, we know today that it is not, and yet the FDA continues to replicate that bad data, crunching the same analytical basis that they have, and they're simply wrong, however smart that they may be. On August 31st of 2016, the DEA published that emergency scheduling order, and then shortly thereafter, on October 13th of 2016, they withdrew it. Now, the significant thing about that is that in 80-some-odd attempts prior to that to schedule under the emergency scheduling authority granted by the Congress to the DEA, they were successful. It is the first time in the history that the DEA withdrew an emergency scheduling order, and it was because the science that the FDA gave to the DEA was bad. It was junk science. And now, in 2017, FDA Commissioner Gottlieb is repeating that same junk science in order to justify both a public health advisory on kratom and to request that the DEA consider scheduling it again, just as he did. Now, at the time that the DEA withdrew their notice, they did request from the FDA an expedited 8-factor analysis, which is the statutory requirement for scheduling of any controlled substance. That 8-factor analysis was supposed to be delivered by the FDA to the Drug Enforcement Administration on December 1st of 2016. They failed to do so. It was an emergency in the eyes of the FDA. They didn't even have the ability to generate an 8-factor analysis that would support their claim that kratom was dangerous. We know today that it is not. However, the American Kratom Association did commission with Dr. Henningfield and PinneyAssociates an 8-factor analysis that mirrored the federal statutory requirements and analyzed in detail each of those factors to determine whether or not it was scheduled. Dr. Henningfield referred to his 8-factor analysis just a few moments ago, and his conclusions were that the kratom is not dangerously addictive and it is not appropriate for scheduling. And yet, here we are with a recommendation today from the FDA that we should schedule it. In fact, kratom gives you a mild pain relief effect and a mild mood boost. It has been safely used for centuries in Southeast Asia by those populations. And there is no evidence in public literature that there's ever been a single death over that centuries of use related to kratom. There is today in the United States no causality that can be drawn to any death that can be attributed exclusively to kratom. Kratom does contain alkaloids that hit the same pain receptors in your brain as opioids do, but it's not unique. Chocolate does that, caffeine, nutmeg, St. John's wort. There are a number of substances that hit that same pain receptor, but you have to view the pain receptor as a doorway. And when that pain, when the substance hits that doorway, kratom goes to the pain nerves and controls the pain. Opioids goes to the same pain centers, and then it attacks the respiratory system and suppresses your ability to function from a respiratory standpoint. I think all of us have been in the situation in the middle of the night, we've been awakened by a beeping of a smoke alarm because the battery went dead. And it's a nuisance. And we think to ourselves, how can we solve the problem? If you were to take kratom as a solution to that, kratom would go in, it would replace the battery, reset the smoke detector, and you could go back to sleep. An opioid would tear out the battery, it would fill the room with smoke, making it nearly impossible for you to breathe, and then it would try to burn the house down. That's the difference in an analogous form as to what kratom does with respect to opioids. Dr. Gottlieb claimed that kratom, in fact, is eligible for DEA scheduling because he believes that it has the same effects as an opioid. He is wrong. The science contradicts that. He claimed that there are many deaths associated with kratom, just like there are with opioids. That's not even close to being true. There's none on the kratom side. And of course, on opioid deaths, we know today that we're seeing 90 deaths a day in the opioid crisis in America. Dr. Gottlieb also claimed that kratom is an analog of an opioid. He is wrong on the science once again. All of those things are wrong, just like Dr. Krugman was wrong on a data misfire about the internet. Dr. Gottlieb is wrong with a data misfire about kratom. Why? People do die today from underlying medical conditions, and they walk around today and they take any number of substances, which could include kratom, and they drop dead. We look for answers in unexplained deaths. Many medical examiners today have been directed by the FDA to look at whether or not the individual who passed away, the decedent, was using kratom. Well, they found that in some cases that's true, but they ignore the fact that most of those individuals are also taking any number of other products, including prescription drugs, and in some cases illegal substances, which have a toxic effect, even if the person had not died from some underlying medical condition. But people also die from drug interactions, and with prescriptions and with illegal substances, kratom can be blended with that and co-administered at the same time, being taken at the same time, but would not be responsible for the death. And we know that people do die from mixing toxic doses of painkillers and synthetic chemicals in an illegal and illicit substance that sometimes blends kratom with it. We know that happened in 2009, and the FDA frequently refers to this situation in Sweden with an illegal street drug called Krypton. Krypton included toxic doses of the prescription painkiller tramadol. It also was blended with kratom. And the FDA chooses to blame kratom as the sole responsible substance for those deaths, and we know from in fact the science it's not true. So here today, Dr. Gottlieb said there are 36 deaths associated with the consumption of kratom. Where is the data? Well, we can look at the FDA's own database to determine whether or not it's true. The FAERS system, which is represented on these charts, and by the way, all of you out there on the internet can go to the AKA website and you will see these charts that are up there. The FAERS system, which is the Food and Drug Adverse Reaction System, is designed to identify public threats when they occur in the marketplace and to be able to act quickly. It is populated and available to any consumer and also medical professionals. It is the gold standard in terms of being able to report all of these deaths. When you look at the data that's associated with it, over the last 5 years, from 2011 to 17, mitragynine was responsible for, according to the FDA FAERS website, 42 deaths. But when you look at the listing of the cases, and you can go in their FAERS database and look at each individual death, there's not a single one that is associated to kratom itself. All were referred to other substances at toxic doses or at doses that would compromise the ability of the patient to survive. It is not due to kratom alone. Now, that's interesting because Dr. Gottlieb said that there were 36 deaths. He's not using the FAERS database, the gold standard, his own database. He's relying upon public literature, which includes the deeply flawed data from the Sweden situation. Then there's another reporting system that the FDA uses, and it's called the Potential Signals of Serious Risks. Every quarter, the FDA publishes the flare that comes up when you have a dangerous substance in the marketplace. If you look at the last quarter of 2017, mitragynine and kratom are not even listed. If you look at every quarter of that FLAIR system, that serious alert system of dangerous substances, back to 2011, which is the first recorded report on the FLAIR system, you will find that kratom is never listed on their emergency FLAIR system, which signals that there's a major public health problem. The FDA cannot even support with their own data the gold standard, the claim that they're now making with respect to kratom. When the Tylenol scare occurred back in the mid-'80s, there were actually 7 people who died when the course of treatment, when they examined that, because of poison that was contaminating the Tylenol product. The result of that was that the FDA looked to find ways to improve the packaging and improve the standards for packaging. They didn't ban Tylenol. You don't ban a substance because it's been contaminated or adulterated with a poison. In the heparin situation that followed, which is the next slide, there were 86 people that died in the United States and suspected hundreds more worldwide because the raw material manufacturer in China that introduced the raw material for the pig intestines, which is a critical part of heparin, they didn't ban heparin, they banned the source of the raw material that was the contaminant. Yet today, the FDA is proposing to ban kratom entirely. If you look at the FAIR system, you will find that overall, in the same time period that is referenced by the FDA, there were 4,488,000 adverse event reports that were done. There were 849,032 deaths reported during the time that Dr. Gottlieb is now claiming that the 42 deaths, or the 36 deaths, whichever standard you apply, relates to kratom. It isn't even a blip on the radar of statistics with respect to the danger that is actually presented. If you look at the mitragynine, the data that is related to the use of OxyContin, there were, in the same time period that is referenced by the Kratom Alert, there were 7,413 adverse events reported from OxyContin. There were 1,145 deaths associated with the use of that product. In oxycodone, same time period, 7,106 adverse event reports that were serious. There were 4,845 deaths related to that dangerous opioid. And with ibuprofen, and this is critical to this argument, ibuprofen is the alternative to opioids, and many physicians and medical practitioners believe that substances like ibuprofen or like kratom can be an alternative pain management option for patients that suffer from pain. With ibuprofen, in the same time period specified for kratom by Dr. Gottlieb, there were 20,251 serious adverse event reports, and there are 2,782 deaths associated with the consumption of those products. So how can it be, with that data, that Dr. Gottlieb is focusing the resources of the FDA to ask for scheduling of kratom as a controlled substance when it offers the option of a pain relief for patients that are currently struggling to find it? And Dr. Henningfield said it correctly, that if you take away that option, we know, based on the studies that have been done, that many of these kratom users will turn to the black market where you have a high degree of unsafe, contaminated and adulterated products, which will result in deaths, or they will go back to opioids. And we know that the abuse of the opioids in this country and the effects that it has on the respiratory systems of users puts those patients at risk. And yet that's the outcome, as Dr. Henningfield correctly pointed out, that the FDA is pushing us to. We want to put patients in a more dangerous, highly addictive setting rather than in a product that is natural, that allows individuals to have the freedom to choose for themselves how they want to actually use products to manage their pain or to maintain their health and well-being. It is an encroachment on the freedom of American consumers. It is similar to what was done back in the early 90s when the FDA decided that they wanted to regulate vitamins and dietary supplements. They did the same thing then. They said there are dozens or hundreds of deaths associated with these unregulated dietary supplements and vitamins. It precipitated action by the Congress to enact the DEA Act of 1994. And that prescribed that the FDA cannot regulate other than for the safety of these products, and we think that's the same place that Kratom should be in today. And Congress may have to act in order to restrict the FDA from their expansion of regulatory powers, which they are seeking with this scheduling order and with the public health advisory. We're asking for reason, we're asking for people to look at the data, and we don't want to see Dr. Gottlieb's data mistake to be replicated into an onerous burden upon the citizens of the United States who want to have the freedom to make their own healthcare choices. Thank you.
Those were the opening remarks of Mac Haddow, who is the Legislative Director of the American Kratom Association. The American Kratom Association is releasing a statement of principle today, and to discuss that document today is Dave Herman, who's Chairman of the Board of the AKA.
We think it's crystal clear that kratom, a natural botanical, is being demonized by attempting to ban it. There's no reason to do this. It has a low potential for abuse, it has a low potential for addiction, and we'd like to see a movement away from trying to ban a good product and get to where we've got a regulatory environment that helps us control the parts of it that might be dangerous. We think the leaf and the leaf product, there's not a thing in the world wrong with them and they shouldn't be touched. Our statement of principles deals more with regulatory constraints on bad actors. I think the Krypton example that Mac Haddow just gave you is absolutely on point. People died from tramadol being adulteration to kratom. We're looking for regulation that supports appropriate FDA actions to ensure the safety and purity of kratom products. We're committed to working with them to share information and collaborate in the development of reasonable regulations to protect the consumer, because to us that's the ultimate goal. While we have seen nothing that identifies a problem with children, we recognize there are some concerns and we would answer those. We prevent youth use. We're not opposed to having an age restriction, 18 and over. Whatever it takes to protect the consumer, helping us with the regulatory environment, we want to do. Same thing with child exposure. Make it child-proof containment. That's fine. No problem with that. But the product purity is a huge factor. And we want to see that the manufacturers compete to provide the highest quality and purest products. And we believe that the consumer is the ultimate beneficiary of that. And we want to make sure that the FDA helps us to control that aspect of it. And that will also take care of potential adulterants. We believe responsible marketeers do not adulterate their products with other substances. And that's a concern raised by the FDA. That's a criminal act. Go do it. Take care of them. Leave us alone. We would welcome standards to prevent contamination and adulteration. And finally, we want to make sure that we make claims that are consistent with the DEA Act that Mac Haddow told you about. This is a dietary supplement. It's a natural botanical. It is not a drug. And we're tired of somebody saying this is a drug of concern or abuse. It's not. And finally, labeling. We want to encourage the FDA to work with manufacturers and marketeers to develop labeling that is appropriate and helpful to the consumer. Thank you.
That concludes our opening statements today from American Kratom Association. We are hosting a live stream today, and we have several questions that have been submitted by viewers who are watching the live feed today, and I will pose several of those to our panel members. The first question is to the group, is if the FDA did not propose a ban in relation to the other products that you highlighted, in particular, I think Mac highlighted those products. If the FDA did not propose a ban in relation to those other products that you highlighted, why might it treat kratom so differently? And does this create a possible legal opening for the kratom industry?
I'll take a stab at that. First, the FDA has an interest in expanding its regulatory authority in order to protect people, and we understand that. But they have to do it responsibly. We believe that in the case of kratom, that the plant itself it should be treated as a food. It's safe. It's been used responsibly by millions of people in the United States, for centuries over in Southeast Asia by that population. We don't think it should be demonized. And so if there is a product that is manufactured from the leaf that extracts the alkaloids, then that's appropriate for regulation by the FDA under the DEA Act, which allows for them to ensure the safety of the products that are manufactured. We also support appropriate regulations that will guarantee that a consumer, when they purchase a Kratom product, is getting something that's safe, that it's pure, it's not adulterated, and not contaminated. And that's the role of the FDA and the DEA. They should intervene and interdict aggressively any bad actor in this supply chain of Kratom products. But because there are contaminated products that sometimes get into the mix, that's not a justification and never has been at the FDA for banning the underlying otherwise safe product.
Can I add to that? None of us are saying FDA should not regulate kratom. That's how FDA can protect the public. And look at coffee. You buy coffee beans, they're pure, they're clean. FDA regulates them as a food. If you buy a product like Coca-Cola here in Atlanta, it has caffeine added. The amount of caffeine is limited as a dietary supplement. FDA can do all of that. That's what we need FDA to do, protect people with its authorities. If it goes to the black market, FDA can't touch it. Then people are hostage to the vultures running the black market.
Well, that's a good set. Go ahead, Dave.
We welcome the science. We welcome a review of the science. Some of that's what we're sharing with you today. There's a legal obligation for a government agency to tell the truth. And we're finding small municipalities all over the country where when we speak to somebody, they say, well, they told us that this is a drug of concern. They told us this, they told us that. But they rescinded the ban in October of 2016. So why is there a continuing movement to demonize Kratom when in fact they're supposed to be held to the higher standard? We welcome the debate, we welcome the science, and we'll go wherever the science leads us. But it doesn't lead to gossip mongering that helps get it banned in small municipalities putting out constant brush fires.
That's a good segue to this second question is, how big of a challenge now does Kratom face, given that both the DEA and FDA seem to be dead set against it? And has there ever been a previous case where a product has faced this kind of opposition and still remained freely available on the marketplace?
I don't mind jumping on that. The reality is we've got a pretty big fight. What is misunderstood terribly is the passion of the Kratom community. These are people that have pulled together. When you look at the ban period and the comment period, we garnered over 122,000 petition signatures. There were over 23,000 comments made on the DEA website, and 99.1% were positive. And we had what we call We Are Kratom. We had doctors, we had lawyers, what Dr. Henningfield referred to as that middle class segment that uses this for the appropriate reasons. And a lot of them are just completely terrified of what's going to happen to their lives. I hear it every day. And so do we have a fight in front of us? Yep, that's very, very clear. But we're not going anywhere, and we think that the community itself is so passionate in protecting their rights, and it is their right, that we're going to stay and they're going to stay, and let's see where this goes.
Let me add to that.
Sure thing, go ahead.
And first, when the DEA made its announcement in August of 2016, we all thought that was game over. As Mac said, Mr. Haddow said, more than 80 times DEA has proposed emergency scheduling. They never changed their mind. My group helped American Kratom Association pro bono at that time because we said it was the right thing to do. And we thought it was game over, but we helped. Within a month and a half, as you heard, DEA withdrew its proposal and put it back in FDA's court. I have confidence that FDA will get it right eventually, but I think they need the perspective of the benefits that it is doing right now to help people in America. We have the Science Foundation. The Science Foundation is getting stronger and stronger by day, but the most important thing is for people that are benefiting to let FDA know, to show the human side. This is real.
I would add to that the people should not assume that the DEA is going to concur with the FDA. They've shown in the past an independence, so they're statutorily required, the DEA is, to do their own independent 8-factor analysis. And I don't think that the data is going to support what the FDA is saying. The FDA has cherry-picked and distorted the data in such gross ways that it will not be supportable, and I don't think the DEA will follow it. But even if they did, even if they yielded to the pressure to try to take Kratom off of the marketplace, the citizens then have the opportunity to file for a public hearing. And that public hearing then puts this matter before an administrative law judge who will weigh the evidence. And I think when the evidence comes out, it will be clear that the FDA is misprioritizing its fight. And maybe they're just trying to divert attention away from the failings of the agency over the past decade in managing the opioid crisis that we're facing today. Had they acted 5 years ago and said, we're going to restrict what physicians can do with dangerously addictive opioids with respect to the number of pills they can give a patient for a continuum of care, they might have been able to stop many of these deaths. But the FDA didn't do it. I know they're embarrassed today, and maybe this is just a reaction to that. But the DEA cannot justify under the 8-factor analysis if they do it fairly and independently, because the data does not support the thesis that the FDA has put forward. It is not an opioid. It's not an analog of an opioid. It does not kill people. That there are always other co-administered substances that are dangerous, that are toxic, that kill people. It's not Kratom, and there's not a single case of a death being associated with Kratom alone. That's the bottom line. And the DEA cannot ignore those facts, and certainly the Congress won't.
I've got to add one clarification here, and that's, can you find anything about Kratom that supports placing it as a controlled substance? And the answer is yes. That's true of coffee, it's true of nicotine gum, it's true of cough medicines, antihistamines. So it doesn't mean that Kratom doesn't do anything that is schedulable, and if it was a brand new drug, you might recommend scheduling. But when you've got something that's been used for many years, you look at the factors, and it's 8 factors, not 1 factor, it's an 8-factor analysis. Factors 4, 5, and 6 get into safety, public health, risk, and benefit. And on that basis, that's why you don't schedule nicotine gum. It meets criteria as a Schedule 3. We don't put it because it doesn't make any sense. Dr. Koop said it best with respect to smoking and opioids. It's easy to get what kills you. We have to make it easier to get what helps you.
Well, could I just add one last thing?
Sure.
Anyone out there that's concerned about their access to this consumer product, that thinks that their freedom is going to be impinged by this action, needs to do an important thing. And I'll steal your thunder, Dave. You need to pull out your checkbook and make a contribution to the AK. This is a fight that is going to take a long time to win. It's going to be very expensive. We're already seeing some well-meaning state legislators who are pre-filing bills in state legislatures because they believe what the FDA is saying. And that is a real threat. And the only way you win in that is to put boots on the ground with lobbyists in those states to fight back and tell the truth and disseminate information that's truthful and accurate, and then we'll win the day. But that's an expensive battle.
This is the final question, gentlemen. Several reporters, and this goes to the numbers that FDA has been talking about with respect to deaths or supposed deaths from Kratom, is the FOIA requests that have been submitted to FDA that have been turned down. How reliable are these numbers that we're hearing about the deaths coming from FDA? Where are they getting this information from, and is this supportable?
Let me make one comment and then turn it to Mr. Haddow, who has been crunching more of the numbers. 9 of the deaths are not even U.S. They're from Sweden, and those are the ones we mentioned when we mentioned tramadol. Now, actually, it wasn't literally the brand name product tramadol, which is a helpful pain medicine, but it was an analog of tramadol in very high concentrations. So they included 9 deaths from Sweden from an illicit street mixture. By the way, there weren't any deaths from Southeast Asia included, where Kratom is used by millions and millions of people, because Southeast Asia has not reported any Kratom poisoning deaths.
So just to clarify for people, and I think this is an important point, the FDA is required by federal statute to provide truthful and accurate information because it is reasonable to expect that the information they disseminate will be used by other public policy entities like the U.S. Congress, like state legislatures, like state and county officials, and even cities. And under the current information that's been disseminated by the FDA, it would not be unreasonable for those people to say, oh, kratom's bad, it kills people. It's inaccurate, but it kills people. So what is the bottom line? The FDA has put all of this information in a black box, and the FOIAs that were referred to, where a reporter filed a Freedom of Information Act asking the FDA for the data that backs up the public health claims that they made in their public health advisory. And the FDA responded back saying, we don't have to answer that question of that FOIA because there is not an imminent health risk associated with the disclosure of that information. The FDA commissioner stood in front of national TV and said that it was a public health threat. And yet the FOIA office says, well, it's not significant enough for us to reveal the information that we're using. So there's a little bit of uncertainty about the exact deaths that they're referring to. The second FOIA asks for the specific autopsy incident report deaths and finding out exactly what the causation of death was. And for each of the 36 deaths, this is a very important point. The FDA's response was, we have no relevant data related to that request. They are bound by law to disclose what the 36 deaths are. And if you take it at face value, they don't have the information about the deaths. They're relying on rumor. They're relying upon loosely drawn, gossipy kinds of data that are sitting out there where people simply repeat the lie over and over and over again, and then they treat it as the truth. The FDA should do better than that, and their own FOIA office acknowledges and proves that the data they're using is not defended by any scientific basis, but rather just that rumor mill.
One final thought on that. We have the feeling that the FDA is running into the ground as hard as they can go, making us chase them because they didn't think anybody would. And so we now have a Me Too mentality that comes directly from the FDA treating kratom the way they are. And so smaller municipalities, states, they're all trying to be part of that Me Too. And so we have people that want to legislate a ban on kratom based on nothing more than rumor and innuendo. Again, we'll go where the facts go. We'll go where the science goes. We would appreciate it if FDA would do the same thing.
And that was our final question today that's been submitted via email from viewers of the live stream. I would ask if we conclude this news event from American Kratom Association, you can go to the AKA website for additional information. And again, I'll repeat that. It's www.americankratom.org. And at the website, you can find a full news release as well as additional information and information on how to get in touch with any of the speakers that you've heard from today. That concludes our news event for today. Thanks very much.